Welcome to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast, where we break down the complex and emotional process of divorce into manageable, easy-to-understand steps. I'm your host, Greer Howard, and with me is Bobby Buchanan, widely recognized as one of Illinois' top divorce attorneys, offering unmatched insight and experience in family law. Well, welcome back to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast, where we break down the divorce process step by step and help you navigate this challenging time with clarity and confidence. I am your host, Greer Howard, and joining me, as always, is Bobby Buchanan, an experienced divorce attorney right here in Illinois. Bobby, how are you today?
Hey, Greer, I am doing fantastic. I'm super excited to talk about today's topic because it is probably the most important thing in the divorce process. I don't think I can overstate that.
Yes. So today we are tackling an issue that can honestly be very emotional, and it is a very significant part of a divorce, especially when it is involving children. So this is the allocation of parental responsibilities and parenting plans. So this is a critical topic for parents that are trying to navigate how to co-parent after a divorce. And Bobby, we've got to dive into the details today. We have so much to talk about, but let's start with, can you just explain what it means when we're saying the allocation of parental responsibilities in Illinois?
Yeah, it's a long term. It's a big term. It means custody. So everyone's heard the term custody. Now we call it allocation of parental responsibilities, or APR. When you're talking with your lawyer, it's okay to say custody. They might correct you, but frankly, in the office, we say custody sometimes just to make it cleaner and simpler. But what that is there's two things that we're going to be talking about today: the parenting and the significant decision-making responsibility.
Okay, so we are going to nix the whole custody term. We're nixing that. And now we've got sort of two components that we're going to break down. And so let's talk about how they play into the divorce process.
Sure. So there's significant decision-making responsibility and there's parenting time. And what we're going to do with these two terms, once we figure them out, once we decide on the details, is we're going to put them into what's called a parenting plan. So the first one, significant decision-making responsibility, is made up of four components. It's medical decisions, education decisions, extracurricular decisions, and religious decisions. So the first thing you have to do as parents in the divorce process, in the process of making your parenting plan, is figuring out who has authority and responsibility for making those important decisions. And there's really just three major ways to do it. Either you have responsibility, the other spouse has responsibility, or you share the responsibility for making those decisions.
Okay, so we're basically talking about, on one side, we have all of these decisions that you could potentially be making. And then we're also going to be talking about the actual parenting time, which is like the parenting schedule. Yeah. So would you say that typically, is it that one parent is going to, get the authority, or typically are they trying to share all of these responsibilities?
Typically in the best divorces, and the divorces that are easy, smooth, or don't get really contested, you're going to share decision-making responsibility. The best way to raise a child is both parents are involved. They're working together. Just because your romantic relationship is no more doesn't mean that you still can't work together. And those are the best case scenario for you as you go through this process, is that you two transition from being romantic partners to just being what one of my colleagues calls co-CEOs of the child. Your job now is to raise the child. And so maybe, you might be thinking about your own relationship, and you might be in the thick of the emotional part of it and be having feelings of anger and resentment. And you're going, how can I work with this person? Well, in my experience, as time progresses and those emotions die down, lots of people that maybe weren't doing so well romantically can actually transition to have a very productive and beneficial co-parenting relationship. So
Yeah.
there is hope for many, many people out there, even if you don't feel it right now.
I love that CEO analogy. I think it's so great because it really is like that. And if you were to run a company, how would you be running that company? So that's such an interesting way to think about it. And it seems like, obviously it's important that you need to have it established, the decision making and the parent time that needs to be written down. But as you mentioned, maybe as time goes on and maybe some of those emotions cool and you're sort of both navigating raising this child, that flexibility could become so important that even though some of these things are written down, if both parents are active in a child's life, that maybe that kind of flexibility card could come in to be a pretty important factor.
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about it, whether you're running a business or raising a child, you're constantly having to make decisions and important ones. And if you have a partner in doing that, there just has to be a natural back and forth where you're working with them to figure these problems out. So you might be thinking about whether or not your child, needs to redo a grade or change schools or get some sort of assessments, or maybe they're struggling with a teacher, or maybe there's bullying going on in school. And you two as parents need to sit down and figure out, is this something we need to do? Is there a certain action we need to take? And it's not going to be helpful if you have to go to a piece of paper and read over, okay, this is where we draw the line here. I'm responsible for this. That it just, practically speaking, it doesn't work. So what the goal is on the front end to decide, okay, we're both in charge of this. We're making a decision that we're going to work through these problems together. And it's more important to come to an agreement together than necessarily be, have it my way or your way. The goal, even with my wife and I, we're married. The marriage is good, but we don't always agree on every single thing in regards to our kids. But what's more important is that we come to an agreement together. And sometimes I concede, sometimes she concedes, or we figure it out. It's the same thing whether or not you're in that romantic relationship or not. You two are working together to raise the child. And the flexibility is so important.
Right. Well, let's talk about the decision-making authority. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that. You had mentioned that there's certain areas, right? So there's education, there's healthcare, there's religion. So how does the court, determine these decisions of like who is going to have that authority? And, does one parent typically, have more? Do they split them? How does the court sort of look at that?
Sure. So the court is going to look at what's in the best interest of the child. And we'll talk a little bit later about what exactly that means, but it's a very broad standard. And really, as we're moving through this process, that's what we need to focus on, is the best interest of the child. We don't want to get to the place where the court is having to decide who is making the decisions. We want to take that decision away from the court itself. If we go through the divorce process and we're looking to the judge to make these decisions for us, then we have a bigger problem. That shows that we're really struggling to be able to agree on anything with our spouse. So there are those 4 areas: the education, health, religion, extracurricular activities. Now, you don't have to have joint decision making on all 4. You can do a combo. You could say, okay, it makes more sense for me to make the education decisions. Sometimes we have clients that are teachers, they're educators, and the other spouse fully understands, like, you know what, this is your expertise, and I'm okay with that. And so I'm going to give you sole decision-making authority. Other times we have clients that are doctors, and the other spouse completely appreciates their expertise and says, you can have the medical decisions. And sometimes we use those areas where it makes sense to concede as actual leverage in a negotiation. We can say, you know what, I'm okay giving that decision-making area up, but let's make sure that we hang on to joint decision-making in the religious area or the extracurricular area. So that is an area where, as a divorce attorney, usually at the beginning with my clients, we just talk in general. Have you talked about this with your spouse? Have you decided, how you're going to make decisions? I would say 70% of our clients say, oh yeah, we've talked about it. We're going to make those decisions together. There is no question about it. Mm-hmm. And then for the other 30% where they're just really not emotionally at the place where they can talk about it, we try to see if there's any way that they can make those decisions jointly. And I'd say in about 10% of cases, just because of the dysfunction of the relationship, there's a power imbalance. Maybe there is, some sort of abuse, psychological or physical. It's nearly impossible for the two to work together to make decisions. Those are the cases where we really got to put our foot down for our client and fight for them to make the decisions on their own. But for the most part, if we're wanting to get through this divorce without much lawyer involvement, without much judge involvement, that it should be almost a given that we're going to share decision making. Mm-hmm. That should be one of the easiest decisions we make. One of the easiest agreements we have with our spouse is that we're going to share decisions. We're going to figure out this together, and those problems and figuring those out together is going to be one of our main goals in co-parenting our kids.
Yeah, I feel like that is just so important. And from my own experience, because, I'm divorced, I've been divorced for a while, but to be honest, off the top of my head, I know that I have two and he has two. Mm-hmm. I don't even remember what they are. I'd have to go look, because I feel like over time, we have just made those decisions together. And it hasn't been an issue of, hey, the paperwork says it's documented here that I make this decision. And I just want to note too, that sometimes when people are still going through that emotional state, that, having a co-parenting counselor maybe talk you through some of those issues can be very helpful, because they're outside of the situation. They're not as emotional. And then also if, maybe like if a doctor has a recommendation that like you've been going to that pediatrician for a long time, or there's a teacher from school, that's teaching your kid that's outside of your relationship, that their opinions can matter as well. Do you ever take that into consideration?
Absolutely. That's something that we can put into the document itself. If we're struggling, to agree that we should be doing joint decision making, that's often a way to kind of soften it for both parents, for them to realize, wait a minute, there's not going to be as much pressure on us to figure this out. We can put in language to the agreement saying that we're going to follow the recommendation of the primary physician or pediatrician, or we're going to follow the recommendation of the child's teachers. So bringing in experts and using a counselor as well, those sorts of experts is a fantastic way to, and I say this happily, but it's against my own interest, use the lawyers as little as possible. At the beginning, use them to understand the framework and to get through and get the agreement done. But the more you can keep us out of it after you finish the divorce, the better for everybody. You do not want to have to go back to the lawyer for any significant reason in regards to co-parenting if we've done this right on the front end.
Yeah. Well, the other thing we need to talk about is parenting time. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit more in detail. And I think when people think about parenting time, they do think about that quote, like custody word. And that, I'm assuming that's meaning the time that the parent is actually spending with the child. Is that correct? Like what exactly, when we're talking about parenting time, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, parenting time is the nuts and bolts schedule. So it's the day-to-day, who is responsible for the child. The most common schedules that we see are like a 50-50 schedule or an every other weekend schedule. Sometimes there's an every other weekend schedule with a midday dinner or a midweek dinner or overnight within it. There's a schedule called a 2-2-5 schedule, which is a way of giving both parents equal parenting time and having some of the weekend time as well. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So there's that aspect. And then we also have to think about what's going to happen on the holidays, who's going to be responsible for the child, who gets the child during the holidays. And then is anything different going to happen for summer vacations? And how do we deal with vacations in general? Spring break vacations, maybe there's some special vacation that you want to take your child on. Does that mean that the other parent gets a replacement time or makeup time with the child? That is the whole parenting time part of it. That can be a little bit more tricky than figuring out the decision making, or at least in some cases where the decision making, there's no question, both parents go, yeah, we're going to share decision making. Figuring out the 50-50 schedule or figuring out the schedule itself can be a bit more challenging.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I think it's more challenging because your emotions start to get involved as a parent and like how much physical time you're with your child. So I can understand why that becomes maybe potentially even a heated issue or something you're really passionate about. So let's sort of talk about that. What is there a typical schedule, and how does the court decide that? Like, do you start with 50-50 and in Illinois, and then based off of certain circumstances, it changes? Do you start with, one parent would have more time? I mean, how exactly does that work? Sort of where is your starting point when you're trying to create this parenting plan?
Yeah, in Illinois, right now, there's no presumption of 50-50 time. Some states do have a presumption of 50-50 time. Basically, what that means is you have to prove to the court why it shouldn't be 50-50. That's not the case in Illinois. The court kind of looks at it from a neutral perspective, not making any assumptions that 50-50 or some sort of every other weekend type of plan is the best. If it does become a contested situation where you're having to get the judge more involved to make those decisions, one of the biggest things the court's going to look at is the status quo, meaning what is actually happening right now. In certain cases, that makes sense to do. If the parties have already separated and the child's living with one parent and the other parent sees the child maybe every other weekend, then that's going to play a big part in determining how strong your case is for, getting that 50-50 schedule. In other cases where the parties still live together and they're trying to figure out the separation, then the court might be looking at more logistically practical things like what's the work schedule of each parent? Where realistically are the parents going to live when they do split up? Where does the child go to school? If you are going to move out and move 30 miles away from the child's current school where they're doing well, where they have relative stability, they have a good network of friends and supportive teachers, and then to convince a judge that it's in the best interest of the child to have to commute to that school or have to change schools, that's going to be an uphill battle. Because you got to remember, the judge is not concerned about you and you winning here and you getting more time. This is about the child. It's always about the child. What is best for them? How can they get through the divorce process with as minimal instability as possible? So that's what we have to think about when we're doing this.
Right. It's always, I think it's just a good rule of thumb to always remember we're coming back to what is best for the child. Right. And so I think that's such a great point to make. And speaking of the child, at what point, I mean, obviously a young child doesn't really have a much of a voice to, give their opinion on who they want more parenting time with or equal parenting time. But is there a point when a child maybe hits a certain age that the court would like to know how they feel about it or what their thoughts are.
Yeah, the law says that the judge can take into consideration the child's preference as far as where they want to live or their preference as to which parent they want to live with. But that is one of, I think, 15 or more factors that the judge takes into consideration. And obviously, their age is going to be a huge factor as far as how the judge weighs that information. And it depends on the child themselves. Certain teenagers may have a preference for what parent they live with, and one teenager might want to live with parent A because they feel like parent A has more structure and more discipline, and they do better in school with parent A. But another teenager might say they want to live with parent A because parent A lets them do whatever they want, and they don't have a curfew, and there's less rules. So it's not just, the kid wants to live with dad, so they're going to get to live with dad. It's definitely more complicated. But I think we should reiterate that once we get to the place where we're thinking about, does the child get a say? What's the court going to do with that information? We have gotten off track, and now we're litigating this divorce, and we might have other professionals involved, and it's becoming a lot more expensive and stressful. So we always want to figure out how we can come to an agreement on these things before the judge gets that involved.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So that kind of moves us on to, maybe establishing the actual parenting plan. So now that, we've sort of talked about the allocation of parental responsibilities and kind of what that means, and then also, talking a little bit about that parenting time, but you actually have to formalize that agreement. You got to make a parenting plan. Yes. So when we're going to be talking about that process, how does that process work? And, when you're looking to do that in Illinois?
Yeah. So when you hire a lawyer to do this, or you just try to do it on your own, and you can actually download these forms, there's not some secret sauce or secret form that we have as attorneys. We certainly do things in a little bit more detailed fashion because we've done, thousands of these, so we know what to look out for. But when you start this process of trying to put together the parenting plan, the best way to do it at the beginning is just to understand the framework. You understand what the significant decision making is and what areas that incorporates. You understand the basics of parenting time. Now, can you sit down with your soon-to-be ex and make an agreement on what you're going to do? And if you can do that, you're ahead of the game. Not everybody can do that. It's really overwhelming to go through the divorce process, and there's a lot of decisions to make. So if you can't do it just by sitting across the kitchen table and figuring it out, the most common thing that happens next is that you'll go to mediation. There's private mediation, and then there's court-appointed mediation. Either one can be effective. But what mediation is, in essence, is you two sitting at a table together. It might be virtual. You might do it over Zoom or something like that. But you're with what's called a third-party neutral, a trained mediator, someone who knows how to help two people who might not see eye to eye on something come to an agreement. And they'll walk you through all the different steps of a parenting plan, all the different areas. They'll help you navigate some of the disagreements you have. And hopefully at the end of that, you end up with a completed parenting plan. And not just the parenting plan being completed, but you've completed the process of getting to the end of the parenting plan, which is as important as the plan itself.
Yeah. I mean, that's huge. So, I mean, really, we talk a lot about trying to cooperate, right, with your ex, and having this other person during mediation is sort of that third party that's not emotional and helping you kind of navigate some of these, they can be really difficult conversations. So let's say they sit down and they're with the mediator and they are able to agree. And sort of they come to you after that and say, hey, we've agreed, what happens next?
So we'll write it up. We'll draft it into a document called a parenting plan, and it'll go through all these different sections. It'll lay out who has decision-making authority, what the parenting schedule is during your regular school schedule, summer schedule, holiday schedule. You guys will sign it, and then you're 50% done with your divorce. Now we just have to figure out the property division stuff and all that other side of your divorce, and a judge signs off on it all, and you're done. I mean, you've done the major work once you and the mediator and your spouse come to that agreement.
Yeah. And, unfortunately, even though you're so hopeful that all of your clients are going to either agree at the kitchen table or agree with a mediator, the reality is there are times when couples cannot agree. And so if they cannot agree during mediation, what steps have to happen after?
Yeah, and I think this is really important to talk about just briefly, at least on this episode, so people know why it's so important to try to come to an agreement with their spouse, even if it feels really hard, why it's really, really important to try to not litigate their case, because what happens next is things get a lot more complicated. The first one is that the court will probably appoint what's called a guardian ad litem, or a GAL as we call them, and that is a special attorney whose job is to represent the child. They call them the eyes and the ears of the court. They can also appoint what's called a child's representative. Same sort of thing. I don't want to get into the technical details too much, but just know that the court is appointing an attorney for the children. And that attorney has a great amount of power as far as how the case might end. They're going to make recommendations to the judge, and the judge is going to listen to those recommendations. They're going to come to those recommendations by interviewing you, possibly coming to your house, interviewing your spouse, possibly going to your spouse's house, possibly talking with the kids. And nobody wants to get the kids involved in a divorce. Like, that's the worst thing that can happen. I mean, we don't want to have our kids even have to feel anything from this process other than we're now going to live in two houses rather than one. So once a GAL is involved, the kids possibly could get involved in the process a bit more as well. So you have that complication. You have the expense of that because you and your spouse are going to be paying for that GAL. And it's going to be at regular attorney hourly rates. So at least a couple $100 to a few $100s an hour you're paying that person. And then beyond that, if you still can't come to an agreement with your spouse, there might be clinical psychologists involved. There might be psychological testing that's involved. It just becomes very much more invasive, complicated, expensive, stressful. It's not as simple as you're at mediation. You're like, fine, I don't agree. Let's let the judge decide. That let's let the judge decide is going to cost you probably a year in time. And I kid you not, a healthy five figures, like $30,000 to $50,000 if you want to quote unquote, let the judge decide. It's just not a smart way to do it and not necessary at all. 99% of cases, you don't need the judge to decide. You just need a little bit of hard work and focus on coming to an agreement.
Yeah, well, there are two things that really stick out to me about that I don't like about that situation. And one is the expense of it. That would make me very nervous and uncomfortable. And then also, honestly, just giving the power up to someone else to make those decisions about my child. And, so ideally, again, as you're saying, it's coming back to if you're able to make those decisions with your ex, just what a difference that can make for your divorce, for your child, for your pocketbook, and for the ability to co-parent your own child and make decisions for them. So I think that's just something so important to remember. And like you said, we'll dive into that on another episode, but that kind of gives everybody a little just brief of, what is to come if you quote, say, let the judge decide. And as we've been talking so much about, everything really comes back to what is the best interest of the child, right? So we keep landing there. And, that's really what the court is going to be focused on, and what you as a parent and hopefully your ex-spouse is also focused on, what is the best for our child. So could we maybe get into some of those specific factors that maybe, are considered of determining, what is the best interest for a child?
Yeah, so there's approximately 17 or 18 factors that the court looks at to decide what's in the best interest of the child. But for our purposes, what we need to understand, it's really everything that affects the child, the court can consider. And the goal at the end of the day is to create an environment that gives the child as much chance at success as possible, as much chance of being well adjusted and having a foundation to be successful as a human being, to grow into an adult that has mental and financial stability. And so what the court does is it looks at, most importantly, what does the child's relationship look like with their parents during the divorce process? Like right now, what does that relationship look like? Is it healthy? Do they have that bond that a parent and a child should have? What is the child's current adjustment to school, to sports, to their community? Are they going to school and engaged with their teachers? Are they active in sports or extracurricular activities? Do they have good connections to their community? All of those things are part of the best interest of the child formula. The biggest thing, more than anything, is that stability piece. What is this going to look like so the child feels like they're in a stable two-home environment and they're not stressing over the fact that they're going back and forth and, they're going to one parent's house and then that parent is maybe, and these are the really sad cases where they go to one parent's house and that parent is talking negatively about the other parent. And that is so psychologically damaging to the child. Like it really should be, they go to one parent's house and they feel the love, and then they go to the other parent's house and they feel the love. And, things are better than they were when the parties were together, because now there's not that stress of maybe a marriage that wasn't as healthy as it could have been.
Right. And obviously you're hoping in every case that in both homes, the child is cared for and it's a healthy environment. But, realistically, there are cases where the past behavior of one of the spouses or, doesn't line up with that. Maybe there's substance abuse or there's domestic violence. So how are some of those factors going to, weigh in? Because I'm sure it's huge for figuring out what's in the best interest of a child.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's be honest, when people are getting divorced, it's more frequent that there is some sort of underlying issue here. People don't just get divorced for no reason. There might be a substance abuse issue, or there might be a domestic violence issue, something that really is significant. And I don't want to paint a picture here for people to think, oh, I have to get along with this person no matter what, because that's better for the child. No, if there's a substance abuse issue, then that needs to be addressed. If there's a domestic violence issue, that needs to be addressed. So in those sorts of cases where the marriage maybe is breaking down because of one of those significant issues, we have to figure out what is the solution for that. When it comes to substance abuse, we need to protect the child. And so that might be some sort of drug testing that goes on, or something like SoberLink, which is an alcohol testing technology to make sure that one parent isn't intoxicated while they're taking care of the child. So we don't want to dismiss those issues at all while we figure this out. But if there aren't those significant issues, then we should be able to get to that resolution without getting too many professionals involved and just figuring it out with the lawyers and between our spouse.
Okay. All right. So as we're, kind of talking about this here, parents that are listening, potentially maybe going through this process, this is a lot of information that we've been covering, but what advice would you have for someone to create a successful parenting plan?
So the process of creating that plan is as important as the plan itself. And what I mean by that is we want to make sure that as we're thinking about this next step, about raising our child as co-CEOs, that we think about all the different details. And I think this is where, as attorneys, we can add some of the most value, because we've seen it on the back end. We've seen it when people don't really do the process in creating the parenting plan. They just go, oh, we'll decide on everything together, and we'll figure out the parenting schedule as we go. And their parenting plan is kind of vague. If it works, and that's great. And you just, you blaze through it. But if it doesn't work, then we get a call on the back end when some detail arises that people didn't think about when they were making the plan. So we want to think about all the contingencies when we're making this plan. What's going to happen during summer vacation? What's going to happen when you go on those long trips for your job where you're out of town maybe for one entire week during the month because you have an important meetings or something? Who's going to take care of the kids then? Is it going to be the other parent? Or maybe is it going to be a grandparent? Maybe you assume it's going to be the grandparent. It's going to be, it's going to be your mom because that just makes the most sense to you. But then the other parent saying, wait a minute, why should grandma get time? It's me and my relationship. So figuring out the rules of the road there. What's going to happen on the holidays? Are we going to alternate those, or are we going to actually split, Christmas? If you celebrate Christmas, are we going to split that in two? Thinking through all those details on the front end is going to save you a lot of headache on the back end. Hopefully, if we've done that work, we sign the parenting plan, the judge signs it, you put it in a drawer, and just like you, 8 years down the road, you don't even remember exactly what's on that document because you and your spouse or your ex are actually making those decisions together. And
Right.
that goes to the second point, flexibility. You want to be flexible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wanted to say that I feel like having that plan, and one of the best things about having an attorney really walk you through this is you think about questions and you think about things that when you're going through your divorce, you're probably not thinking about. Mm-hmm. So it's great for an attorney to say, well, what about vacation? What about if you're out of town for work? Does the child go to you? Does it go to a grandparent? Just like you were saying, because those certain things are not maybe on top of mind. So I think that is really one of the reasons it's so important to have an attorney walk through that process with you so that you really don't have any loose ends. Right. And, and then you talk about, being flexible. And I do think that, later when some of those emotions die down, it is easier to be flexible. But let's talk a little bit about that. Let's say you make your parenting plan and a few years go by or some time goes by and you feel like maybe some things aren't working. Are you able to modify the plan? And is that an easy process? Is that complicated? Is that something you want to go to the court for? What does that sort of look like?
Yeah, so modifying the parenting plan is an option. It's always an option, or I should say, it's always something that we can look at as an attorneys to see whether or not going into court to changing it is a possibility. The legal standard is there has to be a significant change in circumstances or a substantial change in circumstances. Some areas just require a change in circumstances. But let's leave it at that. If there's a change, it's possible you could go into court and change your parenting plan. But I really don't recommend going back to court to have to change it unless it's absolutely in the best interest of the child, because going back to court to change a parenting plan is almost harder, usually is harder than making the plan in the first place. So if you're thinking about, I need to go back into court and change this, then it has to be a very, very good reason, because you're going to spend probably 6 months to a year in court trying to adjust this thing. Now, if you just need to change it because things have actually changed how you're doing it day to day, and you and your spouse are still on the same page, but you've started doing things so entirely different than what is in your parenting plan, like maybe, and there are good reasons to do this. The most common one is maybe you're 50-50 when you start. You start your chapter post marriage chapter, you're 50-50. But then 5 years down the road, because of somebody moving or because of work schedules, you've kind of transitioned to an every other weekend thing. There might be a good practical reason to go back in for you and memorialize that and to get the judge to sign off on it. So definitely don't hesitate to get a consultation with an attorney if you think there might be a reason to change it. But based on that attorney's advice, really think about whether or not it makes sense for you to go in and change it. Because what it'll do in a lot of cases is it'll poke the bear. It'll make things even more difficult as far as your co-parenting relationship. So we want to be cautious. Just because you can do something legally doesn't mean it makes sense practically.
Right. No, that makes sense. So the parenting plan is not necessarily set in stone, but you better have a valid reason to change it if you're going to go through all that, right?
Exactly.
Oh my gosh. Well, Bobby, this has been such an incredible and insightful conversation today. We have, covered the allocation of parental responsibilities and the parenting plan. And, for anybody that's going through the process, having that solid plan in place really is going to make a difference for their futures is basically what I'm hearing, right?
Absolutely. As long as you have clear focus on this, you can let your emotions settle or get a mediator to help. And number one, think about your kids. Think about what's in their best interest. It's not about you. It's not about your spouse or winning or losing. Think about your kids and what's in their best interest.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast. We appreciate you being here with us today. If you want to learn more, you can always go to our website, which is rbbfirm.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, we hope that you will share it, comment. If you have any future topics that you would love for us to discuss, please let us know. So we hope to see you next time and have a great week.
Thank you for listening to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast. We hope today's episode gave you clarity and support as you move forward on your journey. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Tune in next week for more insights and expert advice on the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast.